Doctor, we see this kind of machine behind you. What does this do?
This is a high-volume air sampler. In essence, it's a glorified vacuum cleaner that pulls air through a filter. The aerosolized toxins are actually small particles, primarily associated with sea salt, so they're large enough to be collected on a 0.45 micron glass fiber filter. We pull the filter anywhere from 4 to 12 hours at a time, and then we extract it with an organic solvent to pull the toxins out of it. We process them, put them through an instrument called a high-performance liquid chromatograph, which is interfaced with a triple quad detector and mass spectroscopy detector, and then we can determine which toxins are there and how much.
So let's make that into a kindergarten version, essentially. What does this mean?
Yeah.
Well, the red tide organism, which is a dinoflagellate, a single-celled dinoflagellate, the name is Carinia brevis, it produces several neurotoxic chemicals, and they affect our nervous system much the way that a pesticide would. And they're always out there. We always have a few cells per liter or per quart of water out in the ocean, out in the Gulf. When there's just a few of them, maybe 100 or so per liter, there's not enough toxin to cause a problem. But when it gets to hundreds of thousands to millions of cells per liter, as we've had recently, there's so many toxins, as you know, it causes massive fish kills, a lot of problems. And also these toxins get into the air, and they're bronchial constrictions as well as just neurotoxic. And so they cause a lot of health problems as well.
How many of these sites do you have across?
We have 11 of these out. So we've got some here testing inside and outside to see what the difference would be. We have some at Lido Beach, and we have then others at fire stations. The fire department has been very helpful with us. We felt that that would be a good place for security for our 24 hours a day sampling.
What are you doing with this research?
This is for the Department of Health. They're interested in what people would be exposed to when there's onshore winds blowing the toxins onshore.
So you guys conducted this study in, I think, 2006 or after 2006 up to 2007?
We conducted it earlier, around 2003 to about 2006. Yes, we did a long study for the National Institutes of Health, Environmental Sciences. And yes, we did that primarily at Siesta Key. And at that point, we did about 1 to 2 miles inland transect, a very short-term one. This time we're going as far as about 7 miles inland.
How long do you expect these boxes to stay in those spots?
We had expected to do it all week, starting today and finishing Friday. With the hurricane coming tomorrow, we probably will have to stop for a day or two and then start up again.
What does this mean for the viewer at home watching it?
Well, we have had a lot of people complaining of the choking irritation of red tide toxins inland. And so the Department of Health was concerned about what people might be exposed to, so they asked Mote to set up this inland transect grid to just get a handle on which toxins we were exposed to and how much.
Is there any long-term effects to this we should be concerned of?
Well, that's one thing we're trying to find out. We don't really know. We know that if you eat contaminated shellfish like clams or oysters, which are filter feeders, and they accumulate the toxin when they filter feed the red tide organism out of the water, that is very severe gastrointestinal as well as neurological problems. With the airborne toxin, we know that it causes bronchial constriction, so it's serious for people with asthma. But people that are not compromised with their respiratory system, it seems to be a short term. However, there have been complaints of people with headaches or with flu-like symptoms after being exposed. Not everyone, but a minority of people do complain of that. So that's something that the Department of Health would like to look into.
Since this is new and no real bar set, how do you know what you're testing is safe and what isn't safe, the levels?
We don't. That's one of the approaches that the Department of Health is looking into. I think they would just have to do some type of an epidemiological study looking at the concentrations that we get versus the complaints that people are giving.
And for what you're collecting, is it testing, what's in the air right now, or does it have a residual effect, like maybe the past 3 months?
No, we're testing just what we can collect over the period of time that the samplers are running.
What has your previous research found told you? I mean, if you live 3 miles from the coast, are you going to still feel it 4 miles? Like, how far can they go?
It depends on the intensity of the bloom at that portion of the coast and the the direction and the velocity of the wind. The stronger the wind, the more it's going to go inland. The stronger the red tide in the coastal area, the more toxin you're going to have to be blown inland. So almost every day is different, and every patch along the beach is different because the red tide patches move along the shore, and they're different almost every day.
What's the most you've heard as far as how far away from the coast people have?
I've heard people the other side of the interstate saying that they're affected by something. Now, a lot of people smell the dead fish and they smell the decomposing macroalgae, and they think that that's the red tide smell. That's not. What the red tide toxin is the dry choking cough, the stinging eyes. If you get kind of a sore throat and dry choking cough, that's the red tide toxin.
Now, in the previous inland study, I think they said 2.6 miles approximately was the
That was the farthest that we had a sampler. That doesn't mean it didn't go any farther. And it doesn't mean that every day it got that far. But over time, that's the farthest that we had a sampler to collect the airborne toxins.
You said you've gone as much as 7 miles.
Pardon?
North, gone 7 miles.
Yes, we've gone 7 to 8 miles.
How far north, how far south?
The farthest one is just north, is on 17th Street, Bradenton, and the farthest south is on Clark Road.
So obviously you're doing testing in Sarasota County and also Lee
Right.
County. So can you tell us when or where they'll be in Lee counties?
We don't know yet. That depends on what happens to the red tide and what happens with the hurricane.
Do you have an idea of anywhere that they would be placed?
Not yet, no. We want to work with the county, with Lee County, and with their emergency management people.
So let's talk hurricane. What exactly does this mean for the red tide, the storm we're seeing?
Well, that's a good question. One thing we know that as the hurricane passes, right now you may notice we have offshore winds. So that's blowing the red tide away from the shore, and even if it were here, we would not be getting any airborne toxin because it's being blown out to shore. As the hurricane passes, the backside of it will be getting onshore winds. So if the red tide is still here, we will start to get the onshore aerosolized toxins. So that's one effect that the hurricane will have. Hurricanes have been known to disperse the bloom to the point where it doesn't come back. They've also been known to mix things up and maybe get more nutrients available. So after a hurricane, there's more of an intensive red tide. You just don't know what's going to happen any more than you know what's going to happen with the hurricane.
We can't say if it's going to be positive or negative on this red tide.
No, we don't know.
And do we think it'll maybe go to the East Coast even more?
Well, again, that's a good question. We were surprised to find it on the East Coast because normally we're monitoring in the Keys as well. And usually we'll see the red tide as it goes south along the longshore current, going through the Keys, getting caught in the Gulf Stream, and then going north. Normally it will be dissipated in the northern Atlantic, but every now and then an eddy from the Gulf Stream will break off and come inshore. And apparently that's happening up and down the East Coast at this point.
When will you all start to monitor when, now Hurricane Michael starts to come through? When do you guys start monitoring the situation as far as red tide is concerned?
Well, we're going to stop monitoring the airborne because we want to get our samplers out of harm's way.
Right.
As soon as it passes, we will get them back out. But we monitor every day at New Pass and in the Bay. We work with the State Department of Health, the County Department of Health. Every Monday they do a Healthy Beaches looking for pathogens, and they send us samples to do red tide. And then once a month we do a coastal survey up and down the coast in cooperation with the State Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. Our main red tide funding at this point is in cooperation with the State Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. And from that base funding, we're able to leverage funds to do additional things like the aerosol sampling.
How much does this all cost?
Oh my gosh. The aerosol sampling, each series county, it depends on the logistics. With the Sarasota one, it's probably around $35,000 for a week's worth of logistics, which is like a month's worth of sample analyses because we're collecting a lot of samples and then it takes a while for us to analyze them and get the final results.
That funding came through the EPA?
This funding is from the state through the Department of Health, State Department of Health.
And I know you explained what the machine will do, but I know someone's coming to change the filter. Are you able to kind of explain more broken down of how that machine actually works? Like
Yes,
take samples into
it's
it?
just pulling air through a filter and the particles that contain the red tide toxin will be collected on the filter. So that we very carefully fold that filter over, put it in some organic solvent, which immediately starts extracting the toxins. We take it up to the lab, start processing it, get it into a little vial like that, and inject it into our high-performance liquid chromatograph. And when that goes through the mass spectrometer, we can identify what toxins are there and how much.
Thank you.
Thank you.